Throughout history, there have been many sadistic and terrifying execution methods used against people who were suspected of the most heinous crimes. In Britain, there was hanging, drawing and quartering used, and with this multi-step method, the aim was to prolong the suffering of someone. But during the height of the British Empire, there was also a method used in India, as native people accused of mutiny were tied to the end of a cannon and were blown to smithereens, blown into many pieces. Across the centuries, there are many horrific execution methods used, and in this documentary we look at 5 of them that were so terrible that they will keep you up at night. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Death by boiling was an execution method in which a person was killed by being immersed in boiling liquids or water. It was not as common as methods such as beheading, hanging, drawing and quartering, and burning at the stake, but it was used in many different countries and continents, and was known for being particularly horrific due to the fact the executioner often dragged out the killing process over a longer amount of time. Some people were pulled out of the boiling liquid when they were alive, and were made to suffer, being lowered into the pot a number of times, which would make their suffering significantly worse. Often it wasn't just water which could be placed inside of a large pot, the cauldron or kettle. Executioners were also known for filling it up with oil, tar, and using a hook and pulley system to dunk the person in and out, which would have been terrifying for the condemned as they faced the boiling pot. There were a number of people who were executed and boiled to death in Scotland. John Haroldson, who was known as the Bloody Earl of Orkney, ordered the boiling of Bishop of Caithness, Adam of Melrose, and a monk called Serlo. The bishop had been attempting to collect taxes that he had increased, and he raised the price, and with this it was said that the devil take the bishop and his butter, you may roast him if you please. On the 11th of September 1222, a group of husbandmen gathered to protest, screaming roast him alive. Then the bishop's monk Serlo went to deal with it, and he was killed. Then the bishop was dragged into the kitchen, and the kitchen was then burned down, and it was said that he was boiled alive after the earl had given this permission. Some sources claim that he was burned rather than boiled, but Alexander III killed 400 people for the crime against his bishop. William de Soulis, a nobleman who conspired against Robert the Bruce, and whom it's considered was a sorcerer who worked with evil spirits, was boiled alive in 1321. More boilings continued as Melville, the sheriff of the Mearns, and the laird of Glenbervie, who were both hated for their strictness and rules, were thrown into a pot and boiled alive. It was said that after they died, the nobles each enjoyed a spoon of the broth made by them. But boiling was used across Europe as a way of punishing counterfeiters and coin forgers, and these executions were carried out in public to put the other people off greatly committing these crimes. These were seen as stealing from the crown, and by punishing the public in the most savage ways, it was seen as effective deterrence. In 1392, a man was boiled alive in Nuremberg for murdering his own mother, and in 1452 in Danzig, coin forgers were boiled, and this continued the following decades. A man in 1687 in Bremen was boiled to death in oil, and was accused of helping coin forgers escape justice, and some towns today still display their boiling execution cauldrons. The Holy Roman Empire used boiling to death in oil for coin forgers, and those murderers whose crimes were particularly heinous and shocking. It was also used in Asia, and in the 1500s the semi-legendary Japanese bandit Ishikawa Goemon and his son were boiled alive, and then in the 17th century it was carried out in India. A Sikh martyr in 1675 was boiled to death in Delhi after refusing to convert to Islam, and he was first put in a cauldron of cold water, which was then heated up to boiling point, where he was cooked to death. It was said how he was tied with an iron chain, and was prevented from escaping. Only his head and shoulders could be seen to the crowd, before he roasted into a block of charcoal. But the most famous account of boiling alive took place during the reign of King Henry VIII, the infamous Tudor monarch who sentenced over 70,000 people to death during his time on the throne. This included 2 of his own wives who were beheaded inside the walls of the Tower of London. But there was a scandal in February 1531 which emerged from the household of the Bishop of Rochester, John Fisher. Fisher was a staunch Catholic, but inside of his household, a cook had allegedly poisoned the porridge. It's believed that Fisher was the target of this assassination attempt, but he did not eat as he was fasting at the time. But the incident led to the deaths of 2 people, one man and a woman who had sought shelter and charity from John Fisher. This incident threatened to discredit and cause chaos with Fisher's reputation, and some believe that Henry VIII could have even been behind the plot to kill and poison Fisher, as he was a staunch supporter of his former wife Catherine of Aragon, and he despised the changes that Henry was making to the church, and Fisher did not respect Henry's position as the supreme head of the Church of England. The man behind the poisoning plot allegedly was Richard Roos, Fisher's cook, and Henry VIII then changed the rules on treason. Roos was captured and imprisoned at the Tower of London, and was tortured, and he believed he was putting a laxative into the porridge, but claimed he didn't mean to kill anyone. Henry VIII made changes then to the treason laws, and made boiling a capital punishment method and execution method for those who were found guilty of poisoning. This was made because of Roos's actions, and it's believed that punishment was brought in to send a message to the cook. Roos was brought to Smithfield, a common place of burning at the stake, on the 15th of April 1532. Over a period of 2 hours he was executed being boiled alive. One contemporary account stated that Roos was tied up in chains and gibbeted before he was then lowered in and out of the boiling water 3 times until he was dead. Another account described the execution saying, "He roared mightily loud, and divers women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead, and other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at work." It was said the execution made many people sick and ill as it was so brutal. Boiling alive in England was used again for a woman named Margaret Davy, who used poison to murder, but it was then repealed as an execution method by Edward VI's Council. In modern times, it was claimed that in Peru between 1980 and 2000 that a number of militants were executed by boiling, and that the government of Uzbekistan has allegedly boiled some men accused of being terrorists. But boiling alive has to be one of the most brutal execution methods used throughout history. The people who would witness these public killings would be haunted by what they saw, as someone was either submerged or slowly boiled, or were lowered in and out of a boiling pot on a pulley system. It has to be one of the worst methods used along with burning at the stake, and would have been completely sadistic, and those monarchs and rulers who issued it had to be some of the most brutal rulers in history. An oubliette came in a number of different forms. Sometimes they were cells which were shaped like a bottle, in which they were only accessible from a hatch or hole in a high ceiling. These were also impossible for someone to escape from, but other oubliettes were tiny cramped cells, built into walls or corridors. They were sometimes built in the walls of upper floors of castles, and victims could hear the sound of everyday life, and this would drive them mad as they were left in the tight conditions. Inside oubliettes the walls were very tight, and this meant that prisoners would only be able to stand or crouch for 24 hours a day. It was too small to sit down comfortably and also stand up, and the pain of crouching constantly would be agony on the back and the legs, but also on the mind. Prisoners were also deprived of food and were slowly starved to death, and were not given any food, but sometimes guards would give them small amounts of food to preserve the suffering of an individual. Prisoners also had to contend with the remains of previous inmates, as corpses and human remains of the prisoner who went before were left inside the oubliette, and often rats and vermin would be feasting on the corpse. These carried disease, and in the future it would be the prisoner who would be next. A number of oubliettes have been found that have been covered in human bones, with victims being left there for centuries. The tight conditions made it truly hell on earth, and to inflict a quicker death, there would be sometimes spikes placed in the dungeon, so the prisoner would be cut and an infection would take them quicker. Also, the guards could throw human excrement and litter into the hole in the ground in the prison, and this would cause disease and infection to bring about death quicker. One example of an oubliette can be found at Leap Castle in Ireland, and it's considered one of the most haunted places in the country. This oubliette was built within the castle, and the castle saw much action in the forms of sieges and massacre between different clans who occupied it at different times. Captured members of the rival clans would be thrown inside the oubliette, and at the bottom of the oubliette were many sharp wooden spikes which poked up from the floor, around 8 feet below the trapdoor, which would cause a prisoner to be badly injured when they were dropped in, or many were impaled when they were thrown in, and then they slowly died. There were many different human remains found inside this oubliette, and in the 1920s it took 3 cartloads to transport them away from the castle for burial. One of the most famous prisons and castles in history is the Tower of London, which became a site of torture and execution during the Tudor period. It was where Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, two of Henry VIII's wives, were executed on Tower Green. But here there was a small and tiny oubliette-style cell known as Little Ease, built into the basement of the White Tower, the oldest part of the Tower of London. Inside this cell, which was built into a wall, it was secured by a door, and then guards would throw a prisoner in there for a number of days, before other tortures were also administered. Guy Fawkes, a gunpowder plotter, was thrown inside of Little Ease after he had been racked, and it's believed this was one thing that helped him turn over his fellow conspirators, as he suffered from the psychological torture. Another oubliette can be found at Warwick Castle, and the castle's dungeon had a strong reputation for the oubliette during the 100 Years' War, and the French soldiers heard of Warwick's dungeon cell. They did not want to end up there. The earliest prisoners of the oubliette were the French soldiers that were captured in battle, but the Warwick oubliette is different. It's seen by going into the prison in the dungeon of one of the towers, and down the steps in a separate room, which would have been secured by a few doors, is the oubliette. It is a long and horizontal passage that is dug just below the floor. This would have been secured by a grate, and the victim would be forced to lie prone on the stones below that come up from the floor, and they could not move in any manner, as there was hardly any room, and the ceiling would just be a number of inches above. This cell was incredibly claustrophobic, and would have been very warm and clammy. The psychological torture of the oubliette was very severe, as prisoners would not know when they were getting out, if they ever did, and the majority never made it out alive, and were simply forgotten about and left to succumb to the conditions of the small prison cell. Also in the oubliette, prison latrines or toilets would often flow into them, which would cause more problems, as the victim would regularly be covered in human waste. This is the dungeon where the oubliette is, in the bottom of Warwick Castle. Absolutely terrifying. If you look behind me, that's up there. There would be a door here, you can see the hinges. There would also be a door here as well, blocking someone in, the hole in the ground. So we are now in the oubliette. This is a hole in the ground where you definitely didn't want to be during the medieval period. We're at Warwick Castle, and in the during the 100 Years' War, this hole in the ground was so feared that the French even heard about it back in their homelands. In here, it'd be horrible, there'd be rats, disease, and you'd simply be left to die here. This is a hole in the ground where it was so tight, you couldn't even stand up, sit down or lie down. You'd be starved to death. It'd be absolutely horrible. You definitely did not want to be in the oubliette. There was a form of the oubliette which was used in the Second World War inside of the concentration camps. At sites such as Auschwitz and Dachau, there were standing cells used to torture inmates. These were tiny cells in which sometimes up to 4 different prisoners were held inside of the dungeon, and there was often only a very small hole for oxygen, and prisoners could be held in there for a number of days. These cells really showed the cruelty of the Nazis, and many people actually compared this to medieval forms of torture. But the oubliette was one of the most brutal prisons and torture cells used throughout history. Inside, prisoners would be forced to stay in one position for 24 hours a day and would be left to die. It was simple. People were thrown into a hole in the ground and were just forgotten about. Often diseases would bring death quicker, but inside the oubliette a prisoner would be hoping that death would take them sooner, as it was a horrific form of punishment. To be hanged, drawn and quartered was a very serious punishment, and possibly one of the most brutal administered in history. The punishment was seen as adequate justice for the attack on the authority of the English monarchy, and for this, the most extreme form of punishment was used. Treason as a crime had a rather wide meaning for the kings and queens who felt threatened during the medieval, Tudor and following eras. Henry VIII, for example, believed that simply predicting the death of a monarch was enough for someone to be condemned for this, and he had Elizabeth Barton, a woman who did this, executed for treason. But there were accounts during the Elizabethan period of a number of treasonous plots against the Tudor Queen, and because of this, scores of men were executed being hanged, drawn and quartered, following the plans to put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne, in schemes such as the Babington Plot. Hanging, drawing and quartering in its simplest form was an execution method that used a number of different stages aimed to inflict great pain and suffering, but also aimed to shock the public. The point of this was to get the public to fall into line, and if they saw a brutal execution, they would be less likely to commit crimes such as treason because of it. The first part was a drawing, in which a prisoner would be collected from their place of incarceration and then attached using a hurdle or a wooden frame. They would be tied to this and then would be attached to the back of a horse who would draw them through the streets. Sometimes the prisoner would not be tied to the wooden frame and their head would bash against the cobbled streets, and they could also slip from the frame and this would cause pain. They were paraded throughout the streets, where the public would often throw things and shout obscenities their way, before they were taken to a place of execution. They would be then handed over to an executioner and would be hanged from a gallows or a wooden frame until they were almost dead. If someone passed out, they would be revived, and some executioners, to inflict more suffering, would then hang them again. After this, the person was then disemboweled and emasculated, with their entrails pulled out, and then burned in front of them on a fire. Obviously this could easily kill, but often condemned individuals were forced to watch their parts being burned in front of them. They were then beheaded using an axe, and their body was cut into 4 pieces, with these being sent to different places in a country to be displayed, to act as a gory reminder of the people to behave themselves. Heads were also displayed in prominent places such as London Bridge after the execution. During the 13th and 14th century in England, those who were found guilty of treason were punished in many different ways, including drawing and hanging, but also more brutal ways such as beheading, disemboweling and even burning were used. It was said in the 13th century that a man who plotted and attempted to kill King Henry III was dragged asunder, then beheaded, and his body divided into 3 parts. Each part was then dragged through one of the principal cities of England, and afterwards hung on a gibbet, used for robbers. The first recorded examples of hanging, drawing and quartering were used during the reign of Edward I. Dafydd ap Gruffydd turned against Edward I and declared himself the Prince of Wales, and for this he was captured and then sentenced to what we would regard as high treason. Because of this, Dafydd was drawn through the streets of Shrewsbury near to the Welsh Marches, where he was then executed. He was dragged attached to a horse's tail and then hanged alive, before being revived and then disemboweled, eviscerated, and he was forced to watch his entrails being burned in front of him for sacrilege in committing his crimes in the week of Easter. After this, his body was cut into quarters for plotting to kill the king, and his remains were sent to different parts of England to be displayed as a gory reminder to the people to fall into line. His right arm was sent to York, left arm sent to Bristol, right leg to Northampton, and left leg to Hereford, with his head placed on a spear at the Tower of London. William Wallace in 1305, the Scottish knight and military leader, classed as Braveheart, was also executed in London, following his capture in a similar way, and he was forced to wear a crown of laurel leaves as he was drawn through London to Smithfield, where he encountered the brutal punishment. Further executions in this manner occurred during the medieval period, but treason had not officially been outlined in law until the Treason Act 1351, which was passed by Edward III. This claimed that a monarch's right to rule was absolute, and that any questioning of this was seen as treason. It was also the monarch's duty to protect their throne and lands, and petty treason was also introduced, which outlined offences such as killing a lord or a master, and men found guilty of petty treason were drawn and hanged, and women were also burned at the stake. But it was high treason which was deemed the most serious offence. The Treason Act said that anyone was committing high treason if they committed a number of different offences. These were compassing or imagining the death of a king, his wife or eldest son and heir, violating the king's wife, his eldest daughter, if she were unmarried, or the wife of his eldest son or heir, levying war against the king in his realm, adhering to the king's enemies in his realm, giving them aid and comfort in his realm or elsewhere, counterfeiting the Great Seal or Privy Seal or the king's coinage, knowingly importing counterfeit money and killing the Chancellor, Treasurer, or one of the king's justices whilst performing their offices. With this, hanging, drawing and quartering was seen as a standard sentence for these offences. The execution of the 3rd Duke of Buckingham outlined his sentence in brutal fashion. He was executed in May 1521, and it was said he would be laid on a hurdle and so drawn to the place of execution, and there to be hanged, cut down alive, your members to be cut off and cast in a fire, your bowels burned before you, your head smited off, and your body quartered and divided at the king's will, and God may have mercy on your soul. During certain executions which featured a very angry crowd, they would often get involved in the killing process and shaming process. William Wallace was whipped and attacked by the crowd with rotten food and rubbish was thrown at him, and a priest, Thomas Pilchard, who was executed for being a Catholic priest, it was said at the time, was barely alive when he reached his execution before he was hanged, drawn and quartered. After the King's commission and the sentence of death had been read out, the crowd were then asked to move back from the scaffold where the brutal practice was performed. Sometimes executioners or officials would ask questions to get the condemned person, following their drawing, to confess to their treason, and they were sometimes allowed to speak to the crowd. Often other condemned people would be forced to watch others being executed in the same way beforehand. For example, in 1584, priest James Bell was forced to watch his friend being quartered. It is debated at what point someone would be dead along the process. Drawing, as mentioned, was very dangerous itself, often resulting in a prisoner's head being smashed against the ground. A victim may be conscious at the part of the ordeal where his entrails were burned, shortly before the head was removed and the body cut into 4 bits. It was said that during the execution of Major General Thomas Harrison, a man who signed the death warrant of King Charles I, that he was alive for several minutes after being hanged, and then when he was cut open and disemboweled, he then allegedly tried to hit the executioner, and because of this his head was cut off quicker. During disembowelment, John Houghton, it was said, began to pray before the final part of his ordeal occurred. One of the most famous people to be hanged, drawn and quartered was Guy Fawkes, one of the leading men involved in the gunpowder plot. Fawkes had been caught guarding the gunpowder in the undercrofts of the Houses of Parliament, and after his torture, which involved the rack, he was hanged, drawn and quartered. However, Fawkes jumped off the scaffold before in one final act of defiance, and its claim broke his neck before the sentence was carried out. The practice of hanging, drawing and quartering continued for centuries, and the accounts of them were very brutal. It was abolished in England by the Forfeiture Act of 1870, just over 150 years ago, which is shocking, considering how terrifying the practice was. Hanging and posthumous beheading replaced the old disemboweling and quartering in 1814, but it was still very brutal. The last hanging, drawing and quartering was of David Tyree in 1782. He was a Scotsman who had been caught corresponding with the enemy French. It was said of his execution, from the time he was put on the sledge till he came to the gibbet, he continued in an unconcerned conversation with the jailer, in which he expressed that he thought there were not 3 better, sounder, or honest hearts in the kingdom than his own, which was going to be burned. That there was only one thing which gave him concern, which was that his father was living, and he feared this misfortune would bring grey hairs with sorrow to the grave. He never hung his head the whole time. When arrived at the place of execution, no halter was provided, upon which he smiled and expressed astonishment as the inattention and neglect of his executioners, and indeed the business would have been slowed for some time, had not a rope and pulley been procured out of a lugger that lay upon the shore, during which time he read several passages in a Bible he carried in his hand. After hanging exactly 22 minutes, he was lowered upon the sledge, and his sentence literally put in execution. His head was severed from his body, his heart taken out and burned, his privateers cut off, and his body quartered. He was then put into a coffin and buried amongst the pebbles by the seaside, but no sooner had the officers retired, but the sailors dug up the coffin, took out the body, and cut it into 1,000 pieces, each one carrying away a piece of his body to show their messmates on board. A more dreadful, affecting execution was perhaps never seen. Hanging, drawing and quartering was certainly one of the most sadistic execution methods used throughout history. Blowing from a gun was an execution method which has been around for centuries, from the 1500s, and it was even used in the 1900s. It was used by many different armies, including the Portuguese, in their colonies, and also it was used by the Mughals against rebels who were wanting to send messages to their enemies. But it is most closely remembered as a figment of the brutality of the British colonial rule in India. It was used to suppress rebellions across the country and to execute rebels as well as Indian sepoys who had been found guilty of deserting and betraying the British. But the method was one which was completely barbaric, and the cannon would be loaded with a cannonball at times, but also blanks and even grape shot. There were many problems with the executions, as often when the cannon was fired, with the individual tied literally to the end of the barrel, parts of the body would scatter everywhere, and bits of bone would splinter and actually embed into the bodies of those who were there to witness the execution, and they also would be injured. The individual would literally be tied to the end of the cannon, which was then fired, and there was no chance of escape. The birds of prey in the local area would soon realise and work out what was happening, and they would circle around the execution sites and pick up and eat the parts that were scattered by the cannon fire, and some witnesses would see dogs waiting for their feast. During one execution, which went horrifically wrong, as the soldier who was shot just slipped slightly down the cannon as the shot went off, it was said by a witness, "One wretched fellow slipped from the rope, by which he was tied to the guns, just before the explosion, and his arm was nearly set on fire. While hanging in agony under the gun, a sergeant applied a pistol to the head, and 3 times the cap snapped, the man each time wincing from the expected shot. At last a rifle was fired into the back of his head, and the blood poured out from the nose and mouth like water from a briskly handled pump. This was the most horrible sight of all. I have seen death in all its forms, but never anything to equal this man's end." Another witness described the method of execution, saying, "The prisoner is generally tied to a gun, with the upper part of the small of his back resting against the muzzle. When the gun is fired, his head is seen to go straight up into the air, some 40 or 50 feet. The arms fly off right and left, high up into the air, and fall at perhaps a distance of 100 yards. The legs drop to the ground beneath the muzzle of the gun, and the body is literally blown away altogether, not a vestige being seen." It was also used in Afghanistan, and one witness of an execution there said, "The 3 men were then tied with ropes to the guns, their backs against the muzzle. The rope fastened to one of the spokes of the wheel, passed with a knot round the arms, over the muzzle of the gun, round the other arm, and then to the spoke of the opposite wheel, which kept the body fixed. The Portuguese explorer Francisco de Almeida would blow many people from guns during his conquests, and during one Portuguese campaign in the 17th century, one woman who was suffering so much by the occupation turned to cannibalism, and the conquistadors were so repulsed by this that they were going to blow her from a gun and execute her in this way, until local churchmen and clergy members managed to try and prevent this. But the British in India would have a long history of executing people by blowing them from a cannon or a gun, as they would use capital punishment for a long time. They decided to adopt the old Mughal punishment, and it was the East India Company who settled on this specific execution method, and they would then execute thieves in this manner, blowing them from cannons to deter others. Those who tried to convince others to rebel and protest British colonial rule were also executed in this way. In 1806, during the Vellore Mutiny, there was a nighttime massacre of British officers and soldiers, and many sepoys were killed during the suppression of the mutiny, and 6 specifically were blown from guns. Further plots were uncovered in the years later, and these men were then blown from guns. Sometimes, on the rare occasion, someone who was sentenced to be blown from a cannon could be pardoned. For example, in 1784, when a regiment rose up about their pay, 12 men were ordered to be blown from a gun, but the last one was lucky. He had to witness the other 11 men being executed in this brutal way, and he was tied to the mouth of the cannon, and 3 times the fuse blew out when he was about to be fired, but the man in charge then decided to pardon him for this. One man had a terrible ordeal, as following his court-martial, he was condemned to be blown from a gun, but instead his sentence was commuted to be hanged in chains when he was placed in a gibbet, and he suffered a slow and painful death. The execution method of blowing from a cannon was used a lot during the suppression of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, where many people were executed in this way to try and deter those who were committing insurrection against the British. It was said, on the 8th of June, 2 sepoys from the 35th Light Infantry were blown from guns. 10th of June, in Ludhiana, Peshawar, some 40 from the 54th Regiment were blown from guns. On the 13th of June, 10 sepoys from the 45th Regiment at Fazur were blown from guns, 2 hanged. The same day in Ambala, 10 sepoys from the 54th Regiment suffered the same fate. The 26th of the same month, in Aurangabad, 1 was blown from a gun, 1 hanged and 3 shot. On the 8th of July in Jhelum, it is assumed that captured rebels would be blown away. On the 19th, Aurangabad, 1 was blown away, 2 shot. On the 5th of September, Setara, 6 were blown away. On the 17th of September, Multan, 1 blown away, 121 summarily executed. On the 23rd of September in Karachi, 1 was blown away, 7 were hanged and 20 deported. The local body count on court-martialed individuals then came to 4 blown away, 14 hanged, 22 deported and 3 beheadings. At the end of October, in Rochehand, near Agra, 1 was blown away. On 16th of November, Bombay, 2 sepoys from the 10th Regiment were blown away. In certain regions of India, dozens of people were blown from cannons for their participation in different rebellions. It was a brutal execution method that was deployed as a way of keeping people down and scaring them from joining mutinies and rebellions. It was one of history's most horrific methods and would result in someone being literally blown to pieces. For those who witnessed the executions, it would be disturbing and barbaric to witness. The gibbet was usually a wooden structure in which a metal cage in the shape of a body could be hanged up to or hanged on, and the point of this was to show the remains of a dying criminal or a dead criminal for some time. It was known as being hanged in chains and was a punishment used in England, and following the passing of the 1751 Murder Act, judges were given the power to use gibbeting as a sentence passed upon those convicted of murder. There were many examples of other crimes in which someone would be gibbeted alive for, including theft and stealing sheep and piracy. It was also used for those condemned for treason, and was used for executing highwaymen, and these criminals' remains would be placed next to crossroads or public highways to put other potential thieves off committing crimes. Pirates were also gibbeted close to the low water mark or a tidal part of a river and on a river bank, so sailors would be greeted with the swinging bodies as they came into port. The bodies of pirates would be left dangling, and they would be left for days, until they were submerged by the tide at least 3 times. Others were left for some time in the gibbet. Execution Dock, which is found in London in the Wapping area, is where many criminals and pirates were hanged in cages along the River Thames. Ships would pass under the bodies of convicted pirates, and these would keep people in line. Some people did complain about the dead bodies hanging up in the cages because of the sight and smell of the decaying corpses, and they complained that these were actually a health hazard, and many believed that smells were linked to disease spreading. But others, such as foreign visitors, did not believe in the brutal display of the remains of someone. Sometimes with gibbeting, cages were not always used, but it was used to keep the condemned person locked in a cage. It was said of a gibbeting cage that the body was encased in flat bars of iron, 2.5 inches in breadth. The feet were placed in stirrups, from which a bar of iron went up each side of the head and ended in a ring, with which he was suspended. A bar from the collar went down the breast, another down the back. There were also bars inside the legs, which communicated with the above, and crossbars at the ankles, the knees, the thighs, the bows, the breast and shoulders. The hands were hung by the side and covered with pitch. The face was pitched and covered with a piece of white cloth. Gibbeting was of course also the display of human remains, and during the Tudor period, famously many heads of traitors were placed above London Bridge after they had their date with an executioner at Tower Hill. It was also used in different countries. For example, in Germany, a Jewish financier, Joseph Suss Oppenheimer, was gibbeted in a human-sized birdcage, which was then placed outside of Stuttgart. Hitler would later use this event to try and propagate stories against the Jews before the Second World War. Also, the bodies were often covered in tar and were bound in chains, and with the tarring of the victims, this was meant to keep away decay and to preserve the remains as long as possible. In East Sussex in England, one man who had murdered was hanged and then gibbeted for more than 20 years inside of an iron cage, with his remains continuing to be suspended in the air. But many of those inside of cities and towns would be taken aback by the sight of the dead hanging from the cages. In Australia, the body of a murderer named John Mackay was gibbeted close to a spot where he murdered his victim in Tasmania. This caused a lot of controversy, and the body would not be removed until a friend of the victim actually asked for it to be taken down, as he believed the decaying corpse was too much, and he believed he could not get over the death whilst the murderer's body remained suspended in the air. Some criminals were gibbeted alive, and they would be locked in the cage and then suspended in the air, and there was no way out for them. Over a long period of time, criminals would slowly die from starvation and exposure, as it was known, meaning exposure to the elements and the weather. People would walk past daily and would see the slow deterioration of the person as they lost weight and slowly succumbed to their painful death as people below mocked them. It was usually always men who were gibbeted, as female bodies of murderers were in high demand from doctors and surgeons who would carry out public dissections for science and medicine, and there were many people in the crowd who would then witness this. It was a popular way of seeing punishment being carried out, but often flies would feast on the rotting remains, as would crows, ravens and other animals. The smell would be terrible, and people nearby living near a gibbet had to keep their windows closed and shut, and the decay would often take place for many years. Bones of the condemned, once the flesh had been picked from them, would often fall onto the floor. There would be at times attempts to take someone out of the gibbet to spare them, but some blacksmiths made severe efforts to make sure the gibbet cage could not be opened. One gibbet was even covered with 12,000 nails to stop someone touching it. They were also very expensive to make. In England, the final gibbeting of someone took place in Leicester, as James Cook, a bookbinder, murdered another man. In front of Leicester Prison on the 10th of August 1832, he was executed, and it was then said that the head was shaved and tarred to preserve it from the action of the weather, and the cap in which he had suffered was drawn over his face. On Saturday afternoon, his body, attired as at the same time of his execution, having been firmly fixed in the irons necessary to keep the limbs together, was carried to the place of its intended suspension. Cook's body was then placed on a specially built 10-metre high gallows near to a toll gate in Leicester, and it was said of his gibbeting, thousands of persons were attracted to the spot to view this novel but most barbarous exhibition, and considerable annoyance was felt by persons resident in the neighbourhood of the dreadful scene. Representations were in consequence made to the authorities, and on the following Tuesday morning, instructions were received from the Home Office directing the removal of the gibbet. Gibbeting was one of the most barbaric and brutal practices used in history. There were many who would witness a public display of the remains of a criminal. It was meant to serve as a painful reminder that justice had been done, and was meant to keep people off committing crimes. But it was considered by some to be too far, and if you passed under the gibbet cage, you would not forget what you saw, and it might keep you up at night.